A hostage crisis in Russia ended with the deaths of over 180 children on September 3, 2004. The crisis had started at around 9 a.m. 2 days earlier when 32 members of a Chechen-led Islamist separatist suicide squad stormed the school and took more than 1,000 people hostage, beginning what is now known as the Beslan school siege. After herding most of the hostages into the gym, around 24 men, male staff and fathers, were separated from the group and executed in a different part of the school. Later, at least 2 more men were executed inside the gym in full view of the children. Around the same time, other members of the heavily armed terrorist group repulsed the early police response, and Russian security forces were left scrambling to isolate the school, but their efforts were severely hampered by a lack of coordination between the various groups arriving at the scene, as well as the presence of hundreds of angry and often armed civilians from the local community who were clamoring to start a rescue. After securing the hostages, the terrorists set up their defenses and mined the gym, along with the rest of the school buildings with improvised explosive devices often connected to tripwires to deter any incursions. They then filmed themselves and their setup, including a member of the suicide squad standing on a pressure plate inside the gym designed to act as a dead man switch, and they later gave this videotape to the Russian negotiators to show how determined and prepared they were. For their part, the Russian government had publicly vowed not to use force to end the siege, as they had done with disastrous consequences 2 years earlier. Instead, they called on the international community to condemn the attackers and place pressure on the various Chechen independence groups, while civilian negotiators were allowed to take the lead. But behind the scenes, security forces were preparing plans to storm the school. While this might have been a simple precautionary measure, subsequent independent investigations would later say that at the very least these military preparations, which included the arrival on the scene of T-72 tanks, undermined the civilian operation. Also, in an attempt to control the media narrative, the Russian government initially revealed little about the identities and motives of the attackers, and massively downplayed the number of hostages. But this generally failed to have the desired calming effect, as it prompted demonstrations outside the security cordon by the hostages' terrified family members, and these were broadcast around the world, undermining trust in the Russian government's promises, as well as its later version of events. As the crisis entered its second day, despite sweltering late summer heat, the terrorists refused to allow food and water to be delivered to the school, and many of the hostages, some younger than 5, began to faint and were said to have been left too exhausted to flee the scene during the events of the following day. Eventually, it was agreed that nursing mothers and their infants would be released, but horrifically, some of these mothers had more than one child being held hostage and were forced to choose between leaving with their infants or remaining with their older kids. Now facing what appeared to be a long and public standoff, Chechen representatives agreed to travel to the school to facilitate negotiations, and hundreds of Russians reportedly volunteered to take the place of the child hostages. Around midday on the 3rd of September, with the crisis entering its 50th hour, the terrorists agreed to allow 2 ambulances onto the property to remove the corpses of the murdered hostages. What happened next remains unclear, and who fired first and with what and why is disputed. But during the retrieval process at around 1 p.m., shooting started. Within minutes, many of the various explosives in the building were detonated, setting the gym on fire, quickly leading to the collapse of the building's roof, with the flaming debris falling on top of many of the surviving hostages. With these civilian-led negotiations clearly at an end, Russian special forces were ordered to retake the school. A chaotic and nightmarish 2-hour firefight followed, with dozens of hostages killed and wounded in the crossfire. By around 3 p.m., the fighting had died down, but at least 2 groups of terrorists survived the onslaught. One was bottled up in the school's basement, while another was able to pierce the security cordon and take refuge in a nearby residential building. Sporadic fighting and explosions were heard until at least 9 p.m. that night, and during this time the terrorist-occupied apartment building was demolished by tank fire and what the Russian military describes as flamethrower missiles. Though the siege lasted 52 hours, there were few rescue vehicles or personnel on hand, and the hundreds of casualties were in many cases evacuated by friends and family using their own cars to Beslan's single, small hospital, which was quickly overwhelmed. In the end, 320 civilians, including 186 children under the age of 17, died, along with at least 13 Russian security personnel. 31 of the 32 attackers were killed, though there were rumors that many more had been involved and had escaped in the chaos. The sole survivor was sentenced to life in prison in 2006 and was reportedly still in custody as of 2021. During his interrogations and later at his trial, he testified that the objective of the attack was to sow chaos in the region by promoting ethnic divisions and prompting retaliatory attacks. Along with Chechens, many of the attackers were part of the Ingush ethnic group, and they had pushed for an attack on the school in Beslan, knowing that their victims would be Assyrians. This was done as a kind of payback for the ethnic cleansing of Ingush people that took place in the town during the war fought between the two groups in 1992. The hope for tit-for-tat ethnic attacks, which might have further destabilized the region, allowing Chechnya to once again break free, failed to materialize, thanks in large part to the massive and immediate security crackdown in the region. In the immediate aftermath, the Chechen separatist cause was deeply tarnished by yet another bloody attack perpetrated in its name, and in the months that followed, the Putin regime increased the powers of the federal security forces and introduced a raft of new laws making it easier to investigate and prosecute people for terrorism. There was also a major push to increase Moscow's control over the semi-autonomous regions in the North Caucasus, in part by changing the laws that allowed only candidates approved by Putin to be elected to high office. These beneficial outcomes to Putin's government, the lack of transparency during and after the attack, along with the fact that Russian officers and officials were effectively exonerated of all wrongdoing by a Russian parliamentary investigation, has led to persistent accusations that rather than simply being unlucky or incompetent, the state knowingly allowed the attack to take place or deliberately provoked the bloody end to the siege. In August 2024, President Putin made a visit to Beslan that was heavily publicized in Russia, and during an interview that followed, compared the 2004 attack to the recent and ongoing Ukrainian incursion into the Kursk region of Russia.
Продолжают эту работу с попыткой раскачать нашу страну. Это очевидно. И так как мы боролись с террористами, нам сегодня приходится бороться с теми, кто творит преступления в Курской области, в